there are mass movements that are happening in this society at this moment, concerned with consciousness, but they aren't necessarily connected with liberation. And I think that distinction will make you appreciate that what you're doing here is much more holding onto the handrail than you quite understand yet. Because taking a fix on your evolutionary predicament is extremely useful, as long as you don't get caught in your own melodrama, because this is just another melodramatic storyline I'm presenting to you. Right? Since who you are isn't really ultimately that relevant. It's what each moment is about. But it's still useful to get a little bit of a fix about your predicament. It appears that the physical plane, the earth plane, on which we are incarnating and which other beings may be incarnating on other planets as well, all of the physical planes where beings incarnate in bodies that are visible physically, those planes exist specifically for certain entities that have certain kinds of what are called sanskaras, or certain kinds of predispositions, or certain kinds of karmic predicaments. There are many, many more beings that exist in the cosmos than are being incarnated, than are incarnate on the physical plane, no matter how big the population gets of the Earth. I mean, 4 billion is nothing compared to the number of entities that exist, and that's only human entities, let alone trees and rocks and so on, which are all entities also. The complexity and exquisiteness of the cosmos and the unfolding of the evolution of each separate entity is, there's no word. You can't say breathtaking or awful or awesome, because it's beyond any, it boggles your mind, it blows your mind. There's no way you can handle it. Especially when it begins to, when you come into the plane of consciousness, which is connected with the opening of the third eye, in which you become aware of the design of it and begin to understand that it's all lawful. It's all related in a lawful way, not in a rational, a lawful way that is understandable to the rational mind necessarily, but in a lawful way nevertheless. And so it is that there are a certain type of being that is born on this plane, that takes birth, that enters into a body here. Now, what characterizes those beings that take human birth on this plane, is that they have certain kinds of attachments or clingings. Now, how can you conceive of these? Well, you could do it through the chakras, for example. If you can just imagine a long, like worm, which you call the spine, but it isn't really the spine. We'll call it the sushumna. It's a psychic, like nerve, and it has these little bulbular projections, 7 of them, along it. It's like a snake that ate 7 mice. These little bulges along the way, and each of these is a chakra. And each of these chakras has a whole reality connected with it. Each chakra has its own color, its own sound, its own vibratory rate, and its own psychological dynamics. The first chakra is connected with things like survival. And if you characterize it in your body, you find it located, if you wanted to localize it, although that's a little phony, but if you wanted to do it, it would be down at a point going up between the anus and the genitals and in from the tip of the spine. You come to a point, and that would be that place. And the second chakra, which is called the Svadhisthana, which translates as her favorite resort, strangely enough. I wonder why. It's like the Riviera. And it's connected primarily with sense gratification, with reproduction, sexuality. The third chakra is connected with mastery, control, power, heat, force, energy, that kind of thing. And that's sort of right below your solar plexus, right down there. The fourth chakra is in the middle of your chest. It's called the Anahata, and that's connected with compassion, with I don't know how you call it, brotherhood, or an awareness of otherness, or a feeling of connectedness in a universe outside of yourself. If you want to see those second, third, and fourth ones in terms of psychological theories that have existed in the recent years, the second one would be Freud, in which he says it's all second chakra. He doesn't call it second chakra because for him that's reality. He says it's all sex, or libidinal energy of that kind, genital energy. Then Adler came along with his superiority complex and power, and that was all third. And he said, no, it's really power. That's the real trip. It's not sex. And then along came Jung and said, no, it's not power. It's a collective unconscious. It's something that connects human beings one to another. And Jung was clearly, his fourth chakra was open. And when Jung and Freud would argue with one another, it was really an argument between the fourth chakra and the second chakra. And they were both being very true to what they were experiencing, because when the energy is primarily located in one chakra or another, that defines your reality. And you're not being a liar or a hypocrite. That is your reality. Freud wasn't making believe. That was true. And he couldn't understand. And people in one chakra, preoccupation, can't really understand a human being in another chakra. There's no way they can do it, except that people in the higher chakras can usually understand people in the lower chakras, because their compassion, once they get into the fourth chakra, allows them to appreciate individual differences. The fifth chakra is a delicate one to describe. It has a number of qualities that are peculiar. It's to it. It has to do with one is the turning inward and upward towards God in that chakra. And also it has to do with what's called the gift of Saraswati, or the ability for God to pour through in sound, through singing or through voice or something like that. That's the fifth chakra. These are very crude descriptions, but sixth chakra, the Ajna, is the what's called the third eye, and it has to do, when that chakra is open, it's like wisdom as opposed to knowledge. It tunes you into the universe in such a way that you begin to understand more than you know. You have a sense of the way in which things are in the universe. And when your sixth chakra is open, you start to have the powers, the siddhis, that go with it, of seeing, for example, at great distances, hearing at great distances, seeing on other planes of reality. We'll talk about that another time. And all the fascinating powers that come from third eye being open. When thine eye be single, Christ talks about it in the, I guess, the Aquarian Gospel. Now, and the final bulb or nodule or whatever it is, called the thousand-petal lotus or the Sahasrara, the seventh chakra, the crown of the head, is the place in which you as a separate individual merge into the totality. It's where they call it where Shakti and Shiva come together in union at the point of the seventh chakra. And that's the ultimate merging point. Okay? Now, it's also very complicated. I mean, I'm not going into the complexity of it, but when you go into when you play it this way, and this is just one way of playing it, you don't have to know all this stuff, by the way. You won't be tested in the final exam by God, St. Peter. You can go at it in an entirely different way and never have known about the chakra. People have gotten enlightened without knowing about the chakras, okay? Because actually, you are a series of bodies. One, you could say one inside the other, but that's a little phony too. And there are actually more chakras beyond those seven. There are seven more, and there are seven connected with each of your subtler bodies, your causal body and so on. So that if you were looking at the planes of consciousness, going from this physical plane in which you and I are meeting in Rhode Island, back all the way up to the plane in which you and I are one, between that there are all these planes that are connected with each of your chakras. And actually, in each of the chakra planes, you and I have a relationship. All right? We may only be conscious of it on one plane, or two planes, or three planes, but we actually exist with one another across all of these planes. That will... Now that I've got that stuff out, you can begin to understand that who incarnates on the physical plane are people whose primary energies are directed in relation only to the first, second, and third chakra. Okay. Primarily first, second, and third chakra people are born onto the physical plane. That means that most of the people that exist in the world today are concerned with survival, security of their separateness as a separate entity, their own reproduction and gratification, sense pleasure, and their own power and mastery and control over the environment to protect their separateness. It's all a trip about protecting themselves as a separate entity. Whether they enter into a collectivity, which we'll call a nation, or whatever reference group, it's still the individual, the protection. Now that individual, protecting that individual, especially in the third chakra, is not primarily just physical protection. I mean, you build a psychological web, a mosaic, a model of who you think you are. We call it ego. And you will protect that ego to your own physical death if you're a third chakra person. A third chakra person is the captain who goes down with a ship to protect his own psychological identity as being a captain who goes down with a ship, okay, rather than jumping into the lifeboat even though there's space. You understand? So, now if you look at our society, it's fascinating because you can see that there are, like you take Hugh Hefner, for example. Hugh is primarily a third chakra person using second chakra imagery to gratify his power need, right? I mean, there are some people that are obviously just third chakra people, like Richard Nixon. There's no sexual, well, now there is apparently, but generally there is no great sexual imagery connected with Richard Nixon. It's pretty much straight power. And there are people such as Brigitte Bardot, or there are other examples. Linda Lovelace, yeah. Who are more primarily second chakra people. There is a very interesting phenomenon occurring when you see the obesity in the society and things like that, that it's connected with people moving up to the second chakra. They've got survival. Their father was preoccupied with survival, and then they incarnated into a scene where that's all taken care of, and they're ready now for a second chakra trip. So they're primarily involved with gratification, and they feel that what life is about is to get more of everything. The problem is their bodies can't stand too much more, because they're doing their best to get as much of all of it at every moment as they can. I'm describing now the people that are going down the subway at 5 o'clock, because their reality is survival, gratification, which we call pleasure, called the pleasure principle. Freud's pleasure principle, there it was, second chakra again. And mastery and control. And we have functioned, that's what happened was we moved from the second chakra. When the third chakra, this country is primarily a third chakra country, with the model that if we use the power that is available to the third chakra, which is the intellect, it's not the buddhi, which is the higher mind, it's the intellect, which is called the manas, the lower mind. If you use the intellect, you can fulfill, you can get everything you need to give you the thing that humankind seeks. Now that's very ephemeral. What is it that humankind seeks? The closest you can get is a sense of well-being, a sense of right. Whew. Yeah. For an achiever, which most of you have dallied with a bit, being achievers, it's in a sense of an accomplishment. You work very hard to make the achievement and you finally get it, and there is the feeling of well-being that comes from having proven yourself, having mastered or controlled the environment or your immediate environment. Your ego gets a boost. It's all connected with ego enhancement, that third chakra. And there are bizarre examples, as bizarre as the fat man getting fatter or the fat woman getting fatter because she's rich enough to be able to satisfy all her second chakra stuff. In the third chakra, the examples are these incredible empire builders who can't stop. They have to keep building more and more empire, even though it's gone way beyond gratification for them or even meaningfulness. They can't stop. I recall when I was a younger lad. Actually, I was 17 at the time. And my father was just starting a university. He called it Brandeis. And there was a board of trustees. This is a very funny situation. There was a board of trustees, none of whom had ever gone to college. See, but they were all wealthy Jewish men, because this was to be a Jewish-sponsored, non-sectarian university. So they used to hold the board meetings in our living room, and I was a freshman at Tufts College then. But none of them knew quite how to run a college, you see. So they'd call me in to ask me questions like, is one full professor worth 2 half professors? And things like that. And they were very warm, good human beings, generally, most part. And I recall being on one of their yachts at one point playing gin rummy. with this very wealthy man whose company was listed on the New York Exchange, and he was just moving all of his companies from the north to Tennessee, where there'd be a better tax break. He had had 2 coronaries. His wife wanted just to quiet down, and he was driving himself to reorganize this whole company, although he was already making money. And I said to him, why are you doing this? I was just curious as part of my education. Why are you doing this? He said, well, what else could I do? And there was something very poignant in his predicament, that it was like a third chakra out of control, and he couldn't flip the switch to move to the next chakra, the next level of meaning for himself. Now, what happens is that as a space on a plane, just as there was a time, like if you were born into Africa at this point, a certain part of Africa, you might have to spend all of your time, or India or Bangladesh, for example, you would probably have to spend most of your time just surviving, right? So that would be a certain kind of being who would take birth there, who had that particular kind of work to do. It should be primarily first chakra work, right? And so at different periods in history, in even our history, our small history, not, I don't mean America, but the world history, which is still small, at different parts, the environments have been suitable for different kinds of beings to take birth. And this culture at this moment is very interesting in regard to who's taking birth and for what purposes. Because there are certain conditions that exist in this society at this moment that make it very, very appropriate for beings with specifically fourth chakra work to take birth, which is a very far-out predicament, because I'm sure you're having the experience when you and I meet, or when you meet each other, if you ever get to look in each other's eyes, that you will recognize that you know each other in some way or other, that there's something familiar about you with one another, and that familiarity is partly that you're on exactly the same journey, but the familiarity may be even more weird or far out, in that you've been through journeys together before, working on different parts of your being over time. Because the conditions that exist in this culture at this moment have not existed in other times historically. And it's primarily due to technology. We are the children of a technological age. And that age allows us, along with Einstein's insights and the psychedelic movement, which led into the rock and roll business movement, all that, to have got a whole new set of takes about reality and about time and about space. Because even 30 years ago, if you grew up in a village in this country, it was likely that you could anticipate that you'd be spending the rest of your life roughly around that village, even though the song, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? But still, most people came back to the farm, and their aspirations, because this was previous to television, which had in it a kind of vicarious involvement that allowed you to literally burn out roles, social roles, without having lived them out. prior to television, it was likely that your aspirations and your fantasies involved the social roles that were in that society and were primarily involved with the values that existed within that culture, and that was considered an absolute reality. And when your parents said, face reality, you knew what they meant and you agreed with them. You might have been rebellious, but you never believed that there were any other real choices. Now, that's the environment that I primarily grew up in. And even up until I started taking drugs in the early 60s, my experience was primarily that I was on the main line of reality, and that there were all these kind of weird trips on either side, but that I, as a super scientist, rational mind, power, control, house full of antiques, my airplane, my motorcycle, gratification, more and more sex, more better food, more power, more intellect, I was doing the mainline reality trip, right? And I was hired to tell everybody else what reality was. Okay, that's what a Harvard professor does. And there was no doubt in my mind at all that that's what reality was. Right? Until I took psilocybin. Now, psilocybin or LSD, plus the atomic bomb, plus television, plus transportation, mobility, affluence, on and on and on, changed our whole game in about 15 years. It changed the opportunity to conceive of the fact that there were many realities that were equally real and valid. We read them in books, but books didn't have the same compelling, vicarious involvement that television does. It did it, and well-read people were still more sophisticated and almost relativistic, but not too much so. But for us, suddenly, who were a Beatles generation, we were hearing the Beatles singing of all these different realities. And the teenagers of this culture were being inundated with relative reality. Relative reality. And that was the beginning of a lot of the dropout stuff, which was originally, for example, when I was teaching at Harvard, if a student wanted to drop out of college, he had to go to the psychiatrist, and was treated as a psychiatric problem, right? Because he wanted to leave college, because nobody in their right mind left college, right? That was only in 1960s. And then Amherst came along with a plan to let people take a semester off. They were considered a little weak at first. Now, that's not the schools that had the systems where you could take a work period. That was different, because that's achievement. That isn't it. This was really leaving school. And what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to wander around. You're going to wander around, you know. Does your parents know? You know? Well, where are you going to wander? And that was only about 10 years ago, right? And now the whole scene has gone through another loop, just as it happened with sexuality. We went from a very, very Victorian space about sexuality very quickly through this whole push of another reality of sexual freedom, the height of which, as I've described before, a very humorous image for me, was giving a lecture in Berkeley, which was the leading edge of the sexual freedom movement. And I was lecturing in a small apartment, actually. It was a large, maybe about 100 people there. And the president of the Sexual Freedom League had come to the lecture, and to make his statement right in front of me on the floor, he was making love to his girlfriend. And they were reaching climax, and there were, while I was lecturing, and there were some ladies in their 50s on the side who were totally delighted. And that was the whole movement of what was called external freedom. And the game was, as Tim said it at that time, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And drop out meant dropping out from the main current of society in an external sense. Dropping out from the definition of reality and achievement and accomplishment and success and society and so on that was held as the myths of the society. And the revolutionary movement, which was at its high point in the Democratic Convention, and which was Abby and Jerry and Allen Ginsberg and Rene and all these people, Kunstler and people like that. That was all the same one of pitting one reality against another. Now, the limit of that one, I'm giving you this, I know it's boring to some of you, but I'm giving it to you so you have an understanding of your own predicament at this moment. It comes out right at the end, if you will allow the sociological dance for the moment. The predicament with revolution is, it's roughly the same value system, it's just a polarization of it. It's pitting the thing against itself. And it has been a case from way, way back that teenagers often would rebel against their parents. Often that rebellion, it's like if the parents are totally focused on good, you can become totally focused on evil, which is still the preoccupation with good and evil, which is the same reality. It's just the polar opposite of the reality. So that if your parents are conservative, you might be very irresponsible. That's the same game. It's just the flip side of it, okay? So that what you saw, most of the history of even political movements of the Whigs and Tories and the Democrats and the Republicans and so on was always that polarization of values, but it was always on the same plane. It's always horizontal. It was always a horizontal confrontation. And as the revolutionary movement got stronger and everybody got what they wanted, which was more and more external freedom, so that a kid 15 years old could say to his folks, well, see you around, and leave. And the parents, for the first few years, we had all these police reports of missing children, and everybody was trying to hold on to the game, and then finally, oh, well, what the hell, here it goes. And the parents said, well, then they'd the parents would develop a new model saying, he's very independent, and he's going out to seek 2 years before the mast and going out to seek his independence. And the whole mobility of the families and the moving with something like, I don't know what the statistic is, but it's some bizarre number, like a third of the families in America change their living space every 5 years or some bizarre thing like that. It's getting so that everybody's got to live in a mobile home just because you can't afford the time to have land deeds. Because everybody's moving so fast. That mobility made it possible for lots of stuff to happen. And that came out of affluence, by the way. If you're too poor, you can't move around that fast. Believe me. And the predicament happened that when everybody got what they wanted, it wasn't what they wanted. That's the whole way in which evolution happens. That everybody gets what they want and it isn't what they wanted. And that may be it for this life. And then another lifetime, they're ready for the next thing. You've got to follow the train. You've got to not confuse the fact that there is one evolution that is like Darwinian evolution. There is the transmission that goes from parent to child. And then there is an evolution of soul, or an evolution across incarnations. And these are very different matters. You are your parents' children on this plane. But on this plane, this moment, they are your parents and you are their child because it is a karmic necessity that that be that way in terms of both of your karmas. And the last time around, they may have been your child, or your lover, or your brother, or your sister, or your capturer, or your teacher, or whatever. Now let me add in this other interesting statistic that makes the thing even more fascinating. This is something that I've reported before. It was reported in the New York Times Sunday magazine section about a year and a half ago. It was a study done by two Catholic professors about studying mysticism in America. And they came out with the finding that 2/5 of the American population had at some point in their life had a genuine revelatory, transcendent, mystic experience. Okay? 2/5, that's about... I don't know. Well, we have 200 million people in this country. $40 million people? 80 million. 80 million people. 80 million people have had religious, mystical experiences in this culture alone. Right? 80 million people have been blown out of a reality into another reality. Okay? I mean, they've had the direct experience, not just read about it. They've had the experience, 80 million people. But the interesting thing about that statistic, the additional statistic that's in there, is that their sampling of those 80 million people show that something like, I think, 85% of them said, yes, it was the most profound experience I've ever had in my life, and I never want to have another one. Okay? Do you hear that? What that is saying, is that the conditions in this life situation are such that many people have these experiences, but because of their level of incarnation or their evolutionary stage, most of the people that had these experiences need to deny them or treat them as weird or perverse or deviant or psychotic and can't use them. They're not ready to use them. Okay? So what we have is the conditions are right for certain experiences to happen, and they are happening. But who's incarnating here? Only a small percentage of those people can use it. Which means that what the game is very elitist. But it's not elitist in the sense that somebody chooses somebody. It's elitist in terms of who's interested in what. It's totally democratic in that sense. It's equal opportunity. Everybody's got an equal chance to have a mystic experience. But it's up to you whether or not you want to use it or not. Or whether you are at the point where you have despaired enough of all the rest of it to be open to this possibility, or whatever conditions are necessary for you to re-perceive yourself in terms of your new experience. It's like when my mother was dying, I remember she was under morphine and I was under mescaline, and we spent a day together in the hospital, zonked out of our skulls, just floating around. There was no mother and child. We were just in ecstasy together, just floating. I mean, she was totally stoned out of her skull, and we were just floating, just in ecstasy together. And I was so pleased to have broken through with my mother. And the next day, the morphine had worn off. And I said, wasn't that a beautiful day? She said, it was terrible. I was out of my mind. And you could see that ego structure grab back hold again. And so it is for most people that they have experiences like in traumatic moments. They have experiences when they flip into other planes of consciousness, and then their mind grabs hold and they go right back in. And they may never awaken again that lifetime. And the beautiful description of all of this given by William James, the philosopher that all we mystics like to refer to all the time, our tame philosopher. In 1906, I almost learned it. I forgot it. I knew it once. It was something like, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of veils, there lie other types of consciousness, each complete. This is not exact, this is paraphrasing. You may spend an entire life without knowing of their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus and they are there in their totality in a moment. Okay, that's roughly it. And then he says, his last line of that paragraph is, it behooves us not to prematurely close our accounts with reality. Okay? Which everybody treated as William James' slight deviation, right? His slight pathology. It was like one of the founders of experimental psychology, who did a lot of the original measurements, psychophysical measurements. He was looking into the sun doing an experiment. He became blinded in such a way that he had to be in a dark room for 2 years. And during the time he was in the dark room, he had all these mystic experiences, which he wrote about in a little book. And it was interesting that the major tome that covers experimental psychology, in carrying his bibliography, carried that book for some years and then embarrassedly sort of dropped it out of the literature because it didn't, although from my point of view it was the most profound book he ever wrote, right? It just wasn't relevant anymore to supporting the model of him as a Western rationalist. It's the same way that people don't know what to do about Einstein's statement, I didn't arrive at my understanding of the fundamental laws of the universe through my rational mind. I mean, how could that be? You know, don't all good things come from the rational mind? Well, in actuality, only analytic things come out of the rational mind. The synthetic stuff, the synthesis, and the leaps come completely outside of the rational mind. What is called, in a kind of a pejorative sense, the intuitive mind in this culture, which we call the buddhi, or the higher mind. Okay, so what I've done is said to you that the times were right out of a certain kind of despair and so on, and seeing through an affluence for certain kinds of incarnates to happen. And so the humor for me is, somebody has a baby, and you pick up the baby and you look at it, and if you've even got a little bit of third eye open, you get a sense of this being's previous incarnations, and you see you're holding like some old Tibetan Lama. See? But Tibet isn't a groovy place for old lamas to be born these days. So, or maybe an old American Indian chief. See? And it's this little baby acting like a little baby. See? But as you look at this baby, you know that somewhere it knows, but it may take it years, years, till you are. I mean, you're not here by chance, I hate to tell you. You may have thought you made choices to get here, but that's all just falderall. We'll talk about that later, about the free will and determinism and all that stuff. But that's literally who you are. You are these old beings from times and times and times who have done work, and now it's auspicious that you take birth in this place, because this is the place where you can get a support system for doing your work, because ultimately You can't get up that stairway all by yourself because the force going against it is too great, and you need some kind of a supportive system. Because if you're all alone, you either get beheaded as a witch or burned as a witch, or you get in some way crucified by the society. If you remember, Plato's image of the cave is the perfect one. They're all chained inside the cave looking at the fire, the reflections made by the fire on the wall, and they built a whole reality out of that. And one of them gets free of the chains and goes out to the edge of the cave and comes back and sees the sunlight and comes back in and says, "Hey, fellas, I hate to tell you, but the reality you thought, like down the end of the stairway, there's a sign, it's the same thing." And they stone him to death because he couldn't possibly. What is he doing? He's disrupting the whole social structure. And I had this peculiar moment, which I have described before, of standing in front of the television and the radio business at my moment of glory when I had just been thrown out of Harvard, right? When all these guys looked at me and I was the bad guy, and I was the loser, and I was the one that was going to go into ignominy, right? It's like somebody that's fought Muhammad Ali and lost for the third time. And he's going to end up sort of a training instructor in a gym on the Lower East Side or something like that. Right? And they're saying a final goodbye, He just lost the $100 million purse, and he's just going down, and the debts, and it's all horrible. His woman's left him, and it's all terrible. And I remember standing there and having that look in all of their eyes, And I was sitting there, and this thing had happened inside of me, which was so valid, that I was feeling free. Suddenly I was free of this incredible cultural burden of being somebody who I didn't think I was anymore. But my mind was enough of a psychologist still, my rational mind, that I was saying to myself, look, when you think one reality and everybody else thinks another, you're enough of a psychologist to know you are psychotic, baby. Because that's the only way it could be. Isn't that what the game is? Because psychosis is consensus of reality, about reality. All the psychiatrists agree you need 3 psychiatrists to say you're crazy. And you're crazy. Even though they may be, and you may not be. And this confrontation of realities and this space to entertain realities other than the dominant theme of the culture is very, very important for spiritual growth. Because spiritual growth is the transcending of any limiting conditions or definitions of reality. That's what it's about. It's really what it's about. And if the lid's kept too heavily on and the punishment is too severe for deviance, that's what happened in England, and the Bible had to be read in secret, and then there was the movement that started this country 200 years ago. But you have to understand further your distinction from other beings that are, quote, on the spiritual path. Because this retreat just exists in a moment in time and then it's gone. There's no way you can join. This is not for groupies. There's no institutional identity. You can't get very much social power out of this one. And it's brahmachari, so you can't get much sexual gratification. And the food is good, but it's not, going to take you. You're not going to run here just for that. I mean, it's good, but it's not going to do it. Because really the only people that I want to be around, if I had a choice, I'll be around who I have to be around, but when I have a choice, I want to be around the people who are in truth awakening, not merely taking the spiritual journey and recasting it, their power needs in a way, using the spiritual journey as a vehicle for gaining more power. Because the horror of the scene is that when too many people start up the thing together and the mass movements start, many, many people, that's where the power is in the society, and then a lot of people are attracted for power, not for awakening. And that's one of the horrors of the spiritual scene happening in America at all, is that suddenly it's attractive to people who want power, who don't want enlightenment, or don't want awakening. And you'd say, well, but isn't there the story of the thief in India who spent 12 years making believe he was a saint to hustle people out of money? But he was really a thief. But at the end of 12 years, he had done it so well, he became a saint. Right? That if you imitate something long enough, don't you become it? Right? Again, it all depends on your level of evolution. It's interesting that in psychology, which has attempted to characterize individual differences based on environment and heredity, they have never done a very good job, to tell you the truth. They can account for about, the correlations run about 40 or 50, they're accounting for about 20% or 16% of the variability of individual difference. 85% they have to call, well, those are errors of measurement. That 85% leaves ample space for reincarnation. I'd like you to know there is nothing in science statistically that precludes reincarnation that I can find yet. It's just a whole different slice of the pie. So who you are, in effect, from where I'm sitting, are beings who have taken birth on this plane because you still have stuff in your first, second, and third chakra. There's still energy that pours out of those chakras and defines reality. But in addition, you have awakened at least to the fourth chakra. And some of you to the fifth chakra, so you actually want God. But to the fourth chakra, where you actually want to live in a compassionate universe, not just intellectual liberalism, but real compassion of acceptance and allowing space for individual differences. Now, the predicament is that you can't, once you are in this peculiar mutant transitional space, you can't make believe you're a fourth chakra being and push the first, second, and third chakra under the rug. A lot of you tried to do that. That's my Zumbach, the Taylor story, and the phony holy business. You just can't do it. You can't make believe that you're holy. I mean, I did it, and it was so horrible to me, because I saw with my intellect, since we're into an intellectual overkill all the time, since we are these intellectual achievers, I saw exactly where it was that we were going. I could read all the holy books and say, far out, that's what a realized being is like. See, he wears white, so I'll wear white. He's got beads, and he looks a certain kind of a way. He has soft, milky eyes, so I'll have soft, milky, but slightly firm, so I'll practice being slightly firm, see? And he has a few holy accoutrements, so I'll have a few beads and malas, and I'll say foreign prayers. That'll be helpful, see? And I'll be very good. That'll be important. I'll be good. But a little bit of a rascal, that's important, right? I mean, I could define the whole game perfectly, and I could mold myself into being it. The only thing was there was still a lot of me that didn't fit into that particular mold, that kept slurping out over the edges, you know. You keep trying to push it back in, see? Okay? But you can't handle that hypocrisy. It's too ugly. I mean, the minor ones were, you know, going to a lecture in all my white and stuff like that, and then rushing home and changing into these clothes to sneak out just to get a pizza, because you couldn't, yogis don't eat pizza, and being caught, you know. Or I recall I was in Chicago once lecturing, and I decided in an afternoon to go to a pornographic movie. It was called Deep Throat, I believe, and I was standing in line with my $5, and there was a line of about 5 people in front of me before the box office, and walking down the street was this young, beautiful guy who was obviously very spiritual and light and just spaced, and he came drifting down the street, and he came up to me, and I was just busy standing in line, see, I mean, I was like, and he came up to me, and he looked, his eye caught mine, he said, Ramdas? See? And I found myself palming my $5, see, because I realized I was the last one in line, and what I could say is, yeah, hi, you walking this way? And just keep walking, and then I could go around the block, see, and come back and do it later. Because I saw his eyes go from me down the row to the box office, up to the marquee, and back, and I could see his eyes were like cash registers, or like a pinball machine, a one-armed bandit going through oranges, bananas, and coming. Because it was blowing his mind that who he thought I was could be standing in front of a pornographic movie. And the line moved forward at that moment, and I had a choice. See, I'm standing here, and there's an empty space. See? And I said to him, excuse me, I'm in line. And I lost him. To the extent he wanted what I was supposed to be, I lost him at that moment. Right? Great tantric teaching. I just wanted to see the movie, actually. That's a far-out issue. We'll play with that later. Are they just tantric teachings, or are they tantric teachers as well? Careful, careful. Keep it general. It's only the first day. Let's be nice for a few days. As you awaken to your predicament, then you are faced with, just because you awaken, just because you have realized that the reality you thought was real that defined who you were is only another reality, and you're beginning to understand that there are other realities as well, and that you may be much more interesting than you were thinking you were, and that maybe the schlock, unworthy, inadequate, guilt-ridden achiever that you were busy being isn't necessarily who you have to be for the rest of your life. And as you have a sense of a different being in yourself, which is really what happened to me in psychedelics in '61. Because I had a sense of my own existence quite independent of my social roles. And most people don't have that. Most people are very identified with their social role. And if not with their social role as mother or son or responsible citizen or whatever, or as vamp or as explorer of the future, or whatever social role you think of yourself in, most people are very identified with their bodies. I am 45, I am bald, I am man, I am da-da-da-da-da. And it's interesting, I can just watch the things that changed in my life. I can remember 10 years ago where I let the hair grow very long on this side so I could comb it over here so I wouldn't look, it's like bringing that up over if I could do it, so I wouldn't look bald, because I was busy being identified with the body. And then I began to notice when it didn't matter anymore. It just stopped being that relevant. And it wasn't just a function of age, because there are plenty of people like Frank Sinatra who have hair transplants. But when you sense that you don't have to identify, that you aren't just your social roles nor even your body, then who you are there are still many levels for dispute and confusion from then on, because the first thing you experience is you are a soul, an entity. Then later, Buddha points out with anatta that turns out to be a hype too. But for the moment, you break identification with your body and with your personality and with your sociology in order to become a spiritual entity. Then that spiritual entity has to do its work later on, and that's the transformation that we're having. The problem is that you are, at this point, both or simultaneously a spiritual entity, a psychological entity, and a physical entity. And you can't get rid of any of them quite yet. And there's a horror show in that predicament. That you just get incredibly high in the spiritual sense, and then suddenly your physical identity reasserts itself, and there you are, a lusting animal. And you say, "That's not me," says the soul. And the body says, "You want to bet?" Okay. And the dialogue. And then there's the dialogue between the psychological entity and the spiritual entity. That's what the Bhagavad Gita is about. When Krishna and Arjuna are talking in the line between the battlegrounds, the night before the war, and Arjuna looks over at the enemies, the cousins he's going to take on in battle, and their whole side, and he says, "How can I kill all my old teachers, my old friends, my relatives, and all that? What kind of a battle would it be? What would I win if I won this battle?" And Krishna says, "You just got to do it. It's in the way of things. It's the dharmic thing. You're going to have to do it." And that's exactly what you face. Because what you are in the process of doing is literally killing not the physical body and not the personality. You are killing your identification with them. That's what you're killing. You're not killing your desire systems. You're killing your identification with your desire systems. And what we are doing here is producing a situation for you to allow these things, these identifications, to be loosened in their whole by creating other spaces. That's what the game is about. And you, as a transitional being who started out your life with models in your head about careers, about achievements, fantasies provided by the culture, about family, suddenly awaken to another identity in which you don't have any ground. You can't figure out who you're supposed to be in this new dance. Right? And that confusion is what has characterized the past 10 years, roughly, for many, many, many people. And what many people did was they grabbed at an Indian or a Buddhist or a Japanese or whatever model that was based on an awareness of these higher planes of consciousness to define who they must be, to try to figure out a game for themselves to play. But we are in a unique position. And ultimately, you have to find your part to play in your body, in your personality, in your soul, and beyond all of it. And your every action must be harmonious and true across all those levels. The mistake of the late 60s for many of us was trying to push away the earth to get to heaven. The wisdom now is the understanding that liberation exists with an acknowledgement of both heaven and earth, of both form and formless, of all these things together. And that you don't make believe you don't have a body to go to God. You honor your body to go to God. You honor your sexuality. You honor your social role. And what I'm talking about now is that what our game is, and why there's no groupiness and no identification, and you can't wear a badge and a funny hat and a set of beads, is because this is a much farther out dance than you thought it was, if you thought that was what the game was. Because this is nothing less than what I call a Martian takeover. That is, a being who truly knows who they aren't can be anybody. You are free to be anybody. Now you can be a lawyer. Now you can be a doctor. Now you can be a mother. Now you can just flow into the society, into whatever is needed, and what you bring to whatever is needed is consciousness. And you suddenly feed the society its life-sustaining juices, which is awareness. You feed that awareness into the society, not through necessarily new social institutions. New social institutions must be few and carefully understood as to why they have to be. We did a lot of stuff in the 60s and even into the 70s of alternative culture, economics, politics, and social structures, the whole commune movement. And I was very involved in that, and I can talk for days about that one. And it's very interesting how much of an impact all of that had on this society. In terms of diets, in terms of lifestyles, in terms of art. The whole psychedelic art movement came out of the drugs of the 60s. I remember being on an airplane, and a stewardess was making a woman in her, I'd say, middle 70s in front of me feel comfortable in her chair, because it was her first airplane flight. And she said to her, "What a pretty dress you're wearing." And the woman leaned up in a very conspiratorial way, said, "It's psychedelic," which was far out, since I remember when the word was coined, when it entered the culture by a couple of nuts. And there it was 3 years later, get it out and come into the culture. But the thing is more interesting than a group of people dropping out and creating. And that's what the problem is with physical time-space meetings at all. And that's why this whole game, from my point of view, is merely an intermediate process, and it's ultimately anachronistic. It ultimately is a decadent institution, these gatherings. Because at this moment, that little camera right there makes a statement, and those tapes do something which exactly what this does ultimately. When people are ready, and when people aren't ready, it doesn't give them a phony place to stand. If you can hear what I'm saying, this is a tough one. Because we are awakening at a time when the media are available. They're not available. I was at a retreat in Buffalo. We did a retreat in Buffalo a few weeks ago, and there was a minister and his wife. They must have been in their, I'd say, early 50s. And the wife came up to me and said, "You sleep with us every night." It took me a moment to get it, and then I realized that instead of Johnny Carson, between their toes on the television set at the end of the bed, they put on earphones every night, and they listened to my tapes. Right? And in a way, that's the new ashram. That's the process, and that's the genuine ashram, because in your own home, you're not doing it to impress anybody, and there's no point. Because ultimately, what the community of the spirit is about has nothing necessarily to do with physical time and space. And that's why when people say, "Don't leave me, can I see you again," and all that, I see that as what stage we're at. Because when I go on tour, every day I'd get off at a different airport, and I'd meet people. Oh, Ramdas, you come. And then the next day, don't leave us. And they'd cry. And every day I had these partings and these welcomings and partings and welcomings and partings until finally the elastic band just is stretched as far as it'll stretch. And everybody's like everybody else. And it's like you're saying it to the same person every day. You know, it's they got different clothing, faces and stuff like that. But it's the same person. Till finally you begin to look behind the masks of individual differences, and you see we just keep talking to ourselves, and we're still holding on to old models of who we are and how we're supposed to do it and how we're going to lose it if we don't hold on to it in time and space. And that isn't true at all. That will all come up patently obvious to you as the week wears on. Enough. Our dance is a dance of balance. And mixed in with the work with the energy, which you've started this morning with the pranayama and the hatha yoga, with the philosophy that'll come forward in the lectures, and the meditative practices that will quiet the mind. We work with the heart on many different levels. You start working with the heart just where the heart is. And where the heart is in interpersonal relationship. So the initial work in devotional yoga involves love affairs with God, just like real human love affairs, except for beloved in this case is all of it, is everything you wanted a lover to be ever. And various people can turn on to various kind of love relationships. For somebody, the perfect love relationship is the love that Mary felt for Jesus. For someone else, it's the love that John felt for Jesus. With someone else, it's the love of husband and wife, Sita and Ram. For another, it is the young maiden, the gopi, the milkmaid, and her love for Krishna. Krishna is the beautiful cowherd boy, and he's blue.